So Michael, why don't you tell us what's actually happened with the Reserve Bank recently?
Okie doke. Well, this is just I've got a couple of notes here which I'll look at while I talk. But in terms of their inflation projection, which is, I guess, a key factor in terms of how they set interest rates, they're talking about 1% for 2021 and about 1.5% for 2022. As a result, they've now set the cash rate to 0.1%. And 3-year Australian government bonds also at 0.1%, so virtually zero. They're saying that they're going to probably hold that for at least 3 years because they don't think inflation is going to get to their 2 to 3% target band before then. So basically, from a Reserve Bank point of view, we are looking at a highly flat economy so far as inflation and interest rates go. Now, the other side is that because the governments are now facing all the problems resulting from the coronavirus, what the Reserve Bank's doing in addition is going into a bond buying program. So what that means is that the Australian government and the state governments who can't print money are now offering bonds, and the Reserve Bank is standing behind them. So in effect, it is passing the money printing power to the states as well at 0.1%. So it's costing the states virtually nothing to now borrow, and the Reserve Bank has agreed to fund at least up to $100 billion of borrowings at the moment, but also indicated that there really isn't a limit, that if there is needing to be more money, then they will actually buy those bonds. And the critical thing there is that they're trying to do a full of Swifty and saying that they are not financing government because what they're doing is buying the bonds in the secondary market. And they say that gives them the power to turn off the tap because they just have to stop buying bonds in the secondary market. But in effect, the government's issuing bonds to banks, and the banks are then just simply on selling them to the Reserve Bank or other parties who buy the bonds.
So this brings us back around to the question of whether the Reserve Bank is saying, "Oh, we can't just turn on the tap and give the government whatever money it needs to spend." So what happens instead is the government borrows to spend, and then when that debt is building up in the market, the Reserve Bank comes along after the fact and sort of cleans up the mess by printing money and buying the debt. And then the debt becomes debt owed from the Treasury to the Reserve Bank, which never matters.
That's right.
Right? It's just a historical record of how the transactions have occurred.
Smoke and mirrors, and it's purely so that the Reserve Bank can say we are, quotes, independent from government. At any time, we can stop buying bonds. In other words, we're not printing at the behest of the government. And to a certain extent, that is true compared to, say, if you absolutely made that connection between the government and the Reserve Bank, where basically the government said to the Reserve Bank, you will print me $100 billion and you must do that. And then the Reserve Bank is forced to do it. Whereas this sort of separation of powers does give an independent Reserve Bank some ability to say, no, you're going too far, government. You can issue as many bonds as you like, but we're not standing behind you in the market. So good luck to you. Now,
well, what would take us through the thought experiment? What would happen in that situation? What would happen if the Reserve Bank didn't buy up the debt? Okay. Can you game that out a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I think it's a moot point. I think come the crunch, if the reason the government is raising the money is to keep the economy ticking over, then the Reserve Bank will step in. If, however, the government was being completely profligate, right, and it was financing schemes all over the country that was wildly pushing up demand for resources and crowding out the private sector and, creating white elephants, then I can see the Reserve Bank standing back.
Oh, okay, there's two things I want to pick up on there. One is the overall tone of the conversation is very similar to what we always hear. We always hear, what if the government spends too much?
Yes.
Right? We very rarely hear, what if the government spends too little, except we sort of do implicitly hear it again and again when people talk about stimulus.
Yeah.
Right? We're seeing it now that if the government wasn't just dropping cash as stimulus to people, people have a sense that the whole economy would fall over.
Yeah.
Right? So what we can start to think about is now, classical economists, like classical and neoclassical economists, tend to say that money doesn't matter, that money is a veil drawn over resources, or over resource transactions, right? So really all money's, they're imagining the model of the economy is a market economy, like a market in, ye olde England. And I've made a cartload of soap, and I bring my soap to the market, and someone else has got a cartload of, I don't know, badger hats or whatever, right? And we've got to figure out how many pieces of soap is worth one badger hat. But rather than doing that, we have all the goods being compared against all the other goods via some medium, which is, coins or whatever, which is scarce and durable, and therefore a good stock and value, and a good way of comparing the value of different items. And so therefore government spending and banking, they have their descriptions of that of government spending and banking kind of curtailed by, or sort of hamstrung by, this assumption. And so what Keynes did is he came along and we said, want an investment and production economy. So we imagine that you need money first before you can make the soap, right? You need to build the soap factory first, right? You need to buy a gun and some land to shoot badgers on, or whatever it is. And so that means where money comes into the economy matters, and where it flows matters. And so a lot of what we're saying is very similar to what is called modern monetary theory, but where Michael and I and a growing group of other people tend to differ from modern monetary theory is their focus on a jobs guarantee. And the idea is that they say, we've got all this extra spending, we can use it to do these great things, build parks and have community vegetable gardens and whatever the idea happens to be. Plus, we'll guarantee a job for everybody, and that's way we'll make sure that everybody gets a slice. Whereas with the basic income people, we say, well, let's just start with everybody getting the money, and then that'll create a bunch of jobs anyhow, because people will spend it. And so it's about imagining, if you at the moment, what's happening with the Reserve Bank and the financial sector is debt, financial money creation by the banks is through the roof, right? But it's not it's leading to high stock prices, to higher housing prices, but it's not leading to a sort of strong and vibrant economic recovery. And what we're saying is that's because the money doesn't circulate through the economy; it stays in the financial sector. So what if we just moved it to the population, is where the money sort of comes into the system, and then you see a sort of reorientation of the thing. Does anybody have a question at this stage?
I was just going to ask, where does this money kind of end up usually? Is this where all the construction spending?
Well, this is the question. I mean, when it leaves the banking system, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, construction spending, infrastructure spending. So the New South Wales government is spending $100 billion on infrastructure alone, right? And so this is all debt financed, right? And so it's like the coronavirus, in a sense, has given them an excuse to do this, and they can say there's been this external shock. But what about 2008, when there was no external trigger? It was a purely financial crisis. So what I think, and I'll get and see what Michael thinks about this, is that to an extent, coronavirus may be making the economic situation better, because it's giving the governments an excuse to do the money creation / debt spending that they need to do. And if they didn't have that political cover, we may have had the bubble burst anyhow, the debt bubble burst, and we wouldn't have that political cover for the governments to do the right thing. Michael, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, look, I think that you're right, that fact that so many people all at once lost their jobs have given the government sort of an out, because when the individuals lose their job, it's a really traumatic event, but each individual loses their jobs in very different circumstances. And so you can say, well, it's all their fault. But the trauma is no less when you sum up all those individual people to 5% of the economy than the additional 5% who happen to have lost their jobs all for the same reason. And the fact that it's all for the same reason and all at the same time is what gives this the appearance of something different. But in fact, if the 5% who lost it all due to the virus need a certain amount of money to live, that's just as true as the 5% who individually lost their jobs. And at the moment, that connection isn't being made either by the government or the community. It's as though the people who have lost their jobs through the coronavirus need special help because they were the workers, they were the people adding value. And yet the people who are in the 5% normally unemployed, they're not a group of people who are there for 20 years, all grifting off the state. They're there for 6 weeks, 6 months, tops 2 years for most of them, and they're back at work. So they're all exactly the same people who have lost their jobs as those who lost them in this current crisis. And so, yes, I agree with you, Austin. It's given the government an out, but nobody's yet really making the connection between the existing unemployment who need money and hence the basic income.